ever come across a pattern that uses blended threads, then it might well have seemed a bit confusing, but I'm here to tell you that they're actually one of the easier things to master in cross stitch. Hi there stitchy friends, I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you all the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can learn more about all things stitchy, grow your stitching skills and get the most joy from your stitching. I'm going to cover why blended threads are so useful in cross stitch designs, and I'll show you exactly how to use them with some top tips to make sure they look as fabulous as possible. Now, blended threads refers to the use of more than one colour of thread in the needle at the same time. And you might also hear this referred to as tweeding. As far as I know, the term tweeding comes from the fact that it creates an effect similar to tweed fabric, where multiple shades or colours of yarn are blended together to give a unique mixture. So why have this added complication? Well, there are a few reasons that blended threads can be great for cross-stitch designs. Firstly, blended threads can be used to bridge a gap in shades and allow for subtler gradients of colour. So you essentially create an extra colour to work with, allowing you to transition more smoothly between one shade to the next. This is exactly what I'm going to show you later when we get into the practical part of the video. Here's an example of what I mean. The first sample is simply two individual shades, a light and a dark shade stitched next to each other. The second sample has a blend of the two shades in between blocks of the light and the dark shade. See how the transition is so much smoother and avoids the big jump in colour that you get in the first sample. The blended threads really give a nice smooth gradient of colour across the whole block of stitching. Secondly, blends are fabulous for adding a more textured effect, such as to hair, fur, leaves or stone. And this might use colours that are a little more different from each other, such as a grey and a white, to add texture to animal fur. Finally, you may see blends that use a mix of regular thread and metallic thread, which can add a more subtle touch of sparkle without being the full-on sparkle that you'd get with using just a metallic thread. So I thought I'd introduce here the little fox pattern that we're going to be using later to demonstrate how to stitch with blended threads. But first, let's take a look at how blended threads are shown on a pattern. This will look different depending on how the designer has laid out the chart information. But a blended thread should list all the colours needed for the blend, the total number of strands for each blend, and the number of strands you need of each colour. Each blend will have its own symbol, and that will be different to the ones used for each of the shades when they're used on their own. You'll need to look very carefully at the key and potentially at any other additional instructions to make sure that you know exactly what to use. Most commonly, blends will be 2 strands, one of each colour. But don't get caught out because some blends may use 3 strands with 1 strand of one colour and 2 of another, or maybe even 3 different colours. So I have some examples here that we can look at. This is the key from a dimensions kit. You can see all the standard colours up here. And then there's this section here. This is a separate section for what they've called combined colours, which are blended threads. So this one lists, you can see for the star symbol, it lists 2 different numbers and 1 strand of each. And the same for these other blends here as well. This one is from a kit from Derwent Water Designs and Bothy Threads. And again, you've got the regular colours here. And here I have a section that says blended colours. Use 1 strand of each colour worked together. So here they've put the 2 colours divided by a diagonal line. So you'd use a strand of 342 and a strand of 01. And it gives you the names as well. And again, there's the symbol that would be on the chart for that blended thread. This next example I have is from Bella Filipina, and you can see the long list of symbols and regular ones until you get to the bottom. And right at the very bottom here, there's 1 symbol where it's got 2 shades of DMC. So that's the 2 colours that you'll be using to create a blended thread with that symbol. But you do need to check over here. It's right in these tiny little notes where it just says here, blends are 1 strand each. So this is where I'm saying you do need to check sometimes in different parts of the chart to check exactly what you need to be using. I have another example from a popular cross-stitch magazine. And again, you'll have regular cross-stitch and then a section here where it says cross-stitch in one strand of each. So this one again lists the symbol, the 2 colours that you need, and these extra numbers are for different brands, and the colours. So you'll be using 1 strand of each of these colours and looking for that symbol on the chart. Now, by comparison, there's another chart in here which has the same, but it says cross-stitch in 1 and 2 strands of each, with an asterisk, which you then need to read down here, that says 1 strand of terracotta, so that's 1 strand of 355, and 2 strands of dark mauve. So you'd need 1 strand of this and 2 strands of this 3740 colour. So you'll be using 3 strands in total. And finally, we'll have a quick peek at the key for the fox pattern, which I'm a little bit limited by how my software can lay this all out. So it does look a little different on here because all of the colours come up all in one single list. I don't have them in a separate section. But you can see up here, this is a regular colour, 3853, and then here, for this little gate symbol, you're using DMC 3854 blended with 3853, and it's 1 strand of each. So that's what we're going to be using for the fox. So let's start working with this cute woodland fox pattern. And this is a pattern that's available to buy from my shop on Etsy. And there's a link to it in the description if you'd like to buy it and try out blended threads for yourself. Now, I haven't quite finished this stitching because obviously I wanted to show you using the blended threads. But I'll pop in a picture of the finished piece so you can see what it looks like. So we're going to be stitching with the blended thread and just finishing in the back of the body of the fox. So we're using a mix of 2 orange shades. And you can see some of it already in here on his head, on the tail and around some of the parts of his legs here. And these are the 2 shades that we're going to be using. This darker shade is used just on its own, just right around the edge. So the first step is to select the different colours we need from the blend, which, as we've seen from the key earlier, is DMC 3853 and DMC 3854. And we know it's going to be 1 strand of each. So I've pulled out 1 strand of each of the colours. And then you'll want to take your strands and lay them next to each other. So let's pull that through, let's put those 2 ends together and combine those 2 strands next to each other. Now, if this is longer than you would usually use to stitch with, then you might like to cut this in half. I have my strands pre-cut to 1 metre length and would usually fold that in half to stitch with. So these are definitely too long for me. So let's run that one through, put those 2 ends together and then cut that in half. So I've now got 2 pieces that I can work with. And those are 50 centimetres long each. Now, as a side note, what I like to do is that I have somewhere to store my partially used blended threads. So I want somewhere to store this one that I'm not using at the moment. So as well as having floss drops for the 2 individual colours, I'll probably take a spare floss drop that I can use just to keep any extras on that I'm not using. Now, if you're using a thread card, you could make an extra hole to store the blended thread on, or if you use bobbins, you can again make an entirely separate one just for the blend. I also find this really helpful because if you know you're going to need quite a lot of the blended thread, then you can always prepare a few lengths beforehand and pop them onto your floss drop. Otherwise, you can just create more as you go. Okay, so I've threaded those colours up onto my needle exactly as I would if I was using 2 strands of the same colour. And you may have spotted already the downside of blended threads, which is that you can't use a loop start. if you're not familiar with this method to start your thread, then you definitely need it in your life. So I'll link my video on that for you to check out, up at the top there in a card and also in the description. But for now, I'm going to start this thread by running it under a few stitches on the back. So let's check where I need to be starting to stitch this. And an extra bonus tip for you, this is how I find where I'm going to start. I'm actually going to put my needle in the front of the pattern and turn that over and pull it through so I can now see where I need to start. So I'm going to run that through a few stitches. Brilliant. And then bring my needle up at the front. Let's just check I'm not going to pull it all the way through. No, that's anchored nicely. And then we can just start to stitch away. So I've made 2 stitches there that are the bottom arms, and then when I come back across the top, I'm actually going to use the railroading technique. Now, I have made a video all about this if you want to go in depth on it, but I'll show you here as well because it is especially relevant for blended threads. Now, railroading is a way to get the individual strands of thread to lie neatly next to each other. And the reason I find this is particularly helpful for blended threads is that it ensures that each of the colours is equally visible. Also find that twisted threads are just more noticeable when using 2 different colours, so it may look less neat. So for railroading, I'm going to push my needle between the 2 strands before I put it back down the hole. So again, I'm going to put my needle between the 2 strands and then take it back down. And that should hopefully help those 2 strands to lie nicely next to each other. Now you'll see I don't bother doing this for the bottom arm of my stitches. I've only got 1 stitch here. I'll just do it for the top arm. You might find that you prefer to do it for both arms, but that's really down to personal preference. Right, let's see if we can zoom in a little bit so that you can hopefully see even better. Now you'll notice with this that you can still work rows of cross stitches. Some of these have been single stitches anyway, but here I've got 2. I can work the 2 bottom arms and then go back across. So you don't need to work full cross stitches, each one at a time. You can work rows of half stitches and then go back across them. Now, one other thing you'll notice is that although I'm railroading to make sure that the 2 strands lie next to each other, I don't worry about whether they are lying in the same order for each stitch. So for some of them, the dark stitch will come out lying above the lighter one, and sometimes it's the other way round. Again, that's another thing that you can choose to do. It's really just personal preference. If you want to go that extra mile and have the two colours lying in exactly the same orientation to each other for every stitch. Now, if you were using 3 strands, then the railroading technique that I'm using here, that isn't going to work. But you can achieve the same effect by using a laying tool. And I've included that in the railroading video as well, so you can check that out if you need it. So there's the blended thread section on the back all completed, and there's just a little bit of darker shading still to add on there. So this blended section will sit between this lighter colour and the darker colour on the back. Now, of course, this all works if you're using the number of strands recommended in the design, but it's possible that you might choose to use a different number of strands, perhaps to better suit the count of fabric that you want to use. That's okay, but you might have to get a little creative to adapt the blends. You might think that if you're wanting to stitch with only 1 strand of thread, that could be a problem. But in fact, there is a way to do it, because you could try stitching all the bottom arms in one colour and all the top arms in the other. It's not going to give quite the same effect, and you might have to try out which colour you use for the top or bottom arms, but it's an option. So I've stitched a little sample here just so I can show you exactly what I mean, and I've used exactly the same 2 orange colours that we were using in the fox here. And this sample at the bottom, this is the same. This is using 2 strands, 1 of each colour, exactly as for the fox. For the top 2, the one on the left, I've used 1 strand of the lighter orange on the bottom arm and 1 strand of the darker orange on the top arm. And then I've reversed that over here. So I've now got the dark thread on the bottom and the light thread on the top. So you can see how different they are from each other. But you can also see that actually this is really not too far off the look of this one here. So if you're wanting to only use 1 strand, perhaps because you're using a different count of fabric, then actually this could be a really good option. Now, similarly, if you wanted to use 3 strands, but the blend is given as 1 strand each of 2 colours, then you could increase one of the colours to 2 strands. Again, in a similar way to this, you'd have to test to see which way round you prefer the look of. And the bottom line here is always, if you're stitching a pattern with a lot of blends, and you think it might look odd to use a different number of strands than what's called for, then either don't stitch that design, or choose some fabric that can work well with the 2 strands, so you can stitch it as per the original design. I hope this has shown you just how easy it is to stitch with blended threads and are full of confidence to tackle patterns that use them. Don't forget to grab your fox pattern if you'd like to give it a go. The link is in the description. If you found this video helpful, then please do give the video a like and be sure to subscribe for many more stitchy tips and tutorials. Thank you so much for watching, and happy stitching!